Hello and welcome to another edition of Random Fandom. I am your host Mayhem, and this is my little internet show where I like to rant and rave on everything going on in the world of fandom, everything that strikes my fancy, and in today's episode we're going to be turning our attention to the world of horror movies. I am a huge fan of the horror genre, almost more so than any other specific genre. You know, action-adventure movies are great. Every summer, the big blockbuster movies are always epic and amazing. And comedies have their place. I really love a good laugh. Even some dramas, if I'm in the mood for it. But really, the one genre that I love almost everything from it, to one degree or another, is the horror genre. And ever since I was a little kid, really been into the horror movies, and really love every time a new horror movie comes out. But as much as I love the horror genre, it probably more than any other genre that I can think of has been plagued with a lot of really bad elements as well. So that's what this episode of Random Fandom is going to be about. I'm going to be talking about all of the worst travesties that have happened throughout the years for horror movies, because there's been a lot. I mean, so many just bad stuff when it comes to horror movies. And I don't know what it's a factor of, whether it's the production companies can't seem to figure out what the people want, or they just want to rehash the same stuff because they know it works. But anyway, there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in the genre of horror. One thing that has been happening recently, sort of a recent trend, are all the remakes of classic horror movies. You know, they always say that Hollywood is bereft of ideas these days, and it really seems to be no more apparent than in the realm of horror movies. I mean, in the last 10 years alone, they've remade the big three horror slasher characters. Michael Myers has been remade, New Halloween, and Freddy Krueger with the new Nightmare on Elm Street, and they even remade Jason Voorhees with the new Friday the 13th. So all of the remakes, and they all sucked in one way or another because they lost the critical thing that made the originals so great. In terms of the Freddy Krueger one especially, how can you have Freddy Krueger and not have it as Robert Englund? The new Freddy Krueger movie from a couple years back, it wasn't Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. The guy's not dead. I mean, he's still around, he's still vibrant, young enough to play the character, certainly. I mean, Freddy vs. Jason wasn't all that long ago. And if he didn't want to sign on for it, then you shouldn't have done it. Because that is a character that does not go beyond the actor who plays him. Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger. And if he does not want to do another Freddy Krueger movie, you don't make that Freddy Krueger movie. There is no Freddy Krueger without Robert Englund. And when they redid the Friday the 13th and tried to update that, they lost the core of the character because he wasn't an immortal, unkillable killing machine. He was still a killing machine, but he wasn't immortal. He wasn't the kind of guy who would get shot in the chest with a shotgun and just sit right up after falling down. So they lost the thing that made him great. And the same deal with the remake of the Halloween movies. So all of the remakes they've been trying to do, I guess they all make their money back, so there's no reason for them to stop doing them, but really terrible. Oh, and let it not be said that I forgot about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remakes. What, they've remade that one 3 times in the last probably 10 years? Every one of them worse than the one before, so they keep getting progressively worse and worse and worse. So they really need to stop. I mean, come up with something new. Don't tell me that there's no new ideas out there for horror movies. They're just trying to cash in on the popularity and notoriety of the ones that have already been done. So that's why they're trying to remake them and redo them. And like I said, they're going to keep doing it as long as they keep making money at it. So really, I guess it's us, the consumer, who are to blame for making those films profitable. But they need to stop. They're terrible. They're god-awful. Which leads me right into my next horror film travesty, worst thing that happened to horror movies in a long time. And some of you might disagree with me on this one. Rob Zombie is a terrible, terrible thing to the realm of horror movies. He's done, I believe, up to date 4. He's done 2 Halloween movies, House of a Thousand Corpses, and The Devil's Rejects. So it's not like he's cranking another one out every year or anything like that. But all 4 of those movies are so derivative. It's like, I liked House of a Thousand Corpses better the first time I saw it, when it was called Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I liked The Devil's Rejects better the first time I saw it, when it was called Natural Born Killers. And when it comes to his Halloween remakes, like I said in the last point, you took away the core thing that made Michael Myers so terrifying. He wasn't supposed to be a real person. He was the boogeyman. He was an unkillable, immortal monster. And instead, Rob Zombie made him fairly relatable by fleshing out his backstory as a kid, and also took away the immortal factor. I mean, yeah, he was a tough SOB, but he wasn't the kind of character you could shoot in the chest and then he'd just sit up and keep coming at you. So you take away the fundamental thing that makes a classic movie monster so terrifying, and you try to humanize him, you take away the fear that character induced. So, not a fan of anything that Rob Zombie has done movie-wise. And also, can he stop shoving his wife into every movie he ever does? We get it. You married a cute blonde. She's not that great of an acting talent. Anyway, so moving on from that. Another thing this is one that I've not heard anybody else complain about. This is just something I've taken notice of in recent years. There are an astonishingly large amount of Texas Chainsaw Massacre knockoff movies. There's obviously the Texas Chainsaw Massacres. The original ones, before they started doing the remakes, I think there was like 4 of them, all the way up to Texas Chainsaw The New Generation, which was the one with Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger that made absolutely no sense and pretty much killed that franchise for a good long while. And then about 10 years ago, they started remaking them, and they've had 3 in the last decade or so. Those are fine. You know, those are the ones with the actual Texas Chainsaw Massacre stamp on them. As terrible as most of them may be, at least those are Texas Chainsaw Massacre films. No, there's a ton of horror movies that are almost exactly the same as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's the Wrong Turn series, of which there's half a dozen of those movies. Hills Have Eyes, which are remakes of old Wes Craven movies. The aforementioned House of a Thousand Corpses. And then, for a long time, me and my friends would go to the video stores, and we liked to rent bad horror movies, and every week when we'd go, there'd be a new direct-to-video, low-budget horror movie that was essentially the same exact story. Group of city kids, college kids, go on a vacation on a road trip, get lost in the backwoods of some southern state, and be preyed upon by this family of inbred, redneck, cannibal mutants. And it's like all the time, every week there'd be another one. There was one called Squeal, where they were like half pigmen creatures. There was one called Pig Hunt, and just, there's tons of them. Just go, if you still got a Blockbuster Video around, go and see all the just bad-looking, low-budget horror movies that are the same story. Group of college kids from the city get lost in the backwoods of some low-class, flyover state kind of area, and there always happens to be this redneck, inbred, cannibal, hillbilly clan just waiting to attack them and have their way with them and eat them and all this kind of weird stuff. And it's like, that movie, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was kind of catching lightning in a bottle. It was cashing in on the notion that people who lived in urban environments had of people who lived in rural environments. And that was this fear that they were all rednecks and they were all inbred, and that if you got lost in the backwoods of Louisiana or something, you'd get eaten by a family of alligator people or something stupid like that. And it was okay once or twice, but when you keep driving that hammer into that nail over and over and over again by making that same movie over and over and over again, it kind of gets to be a little insulting, you know? Is like, is this what people from urban areas think of all people from rural areas? If you live somewhere without stoplights, do they automatically think that you're just all cannibalistic mutant monsters. And it's one thing to have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. Like I say, they're fine, but it's when there's so many knockoffs of them. Because as okay as the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre series was, it wasn't the kind of thing that needed to spawn 500 knockoff films that were all exactly like the next one. So there's way too many of those out there, I think. Maybe that's just me. Another problem I have with the horror movie series is another subgenre of horror movies. And it's a subgenre that can really be hit or miss. And I'm talking about ghost movies. Now, some ghost movies are phenomenally great. I want to point especially to the recent films, the Insidious films and Sinister. Really love those, specifically those 3 films. Those are great ghost movies. But a lot of ghost movies from the past 20 years have really not had much thought put behind them, in terms of there doesn't seem to be any rules for how the ghosts work and interact with the world. And I want to especially point to the Grudge series, as well as the Ring series. Now, I know those are remakes of classic Japanese ghost films that I have no problem with the originals. The originals in those are far better than the American remakes. But my problem specifically when it comes to those American remakes is that those ghosts don't seem to have any rules that govern them whatsoever. And we saw this in some other ghost movies that came straight out of America, including Pulse and Pulse 2 and White Noise, and there was a string of ghost movies, fairly low-budget ghost movies like that. And the thing is, the ghosts could do anything they want. They might as well have been gods. I mean, there were nothing that could ward them off. There was no way of stopping them. There was no spell or rune or anything that you could use against them. You essentially had to just not get on their radar. Find a way to not get them ticked off at you, because if they got annoyed at you for any reason, you were dead. I mean, in the Ring movies, it was like you had to make a copy of the tape and then you'd be fine. Well, how were you ever supposed to figure that out? But there was no way to avoid it. You had your 7 days once you watched the tape, and then, sorry, you were going to die. I mean, she came out of the TV. What if you were not around a TV, What if you went out to a cabin in the woods or something? I guess she'd probably, come out of the window or something then. But, yeah, there was a scene in the Grudge especially that ticked me off, I remember, when the ghost in that one, the moaning Japanese girl, came up at this woman from the bottom of her bed. She was underneath the covers, and it slid up through the bottom of the bed underneath the covers and got her there. And she screamed, and then she just, disappeared. And I'm just like, where'd her body go? Did she get, pulled into a ghost dimension or something? Because, sometimes if the ghosts just kill you, fine. They killed you, you got your throat slit, nobody knows what happened to you, or you had a heart attack or a brain aneurysm, and you died, fine. But what, your body just evaporates, disappears? I mean, I might be overthinking it a little bit and getting into physics when I say, mass cannot be created or destroyed, only changed. So what, did she evaporate her body, burn it, turn it into ash, turn it into dust? It just seemed to disappear. And I know, like I said, I'm way overthinking it, and I'm bringing physics into a ghost movie. Maybe I'm nitpicking. Maybe that's just me. But I prefer ghost movies that have a set of rules for the ghosts. They can't come out during the day, let's say. I'm not saying that that's a hard and fast rule that they have to stick to, but maybe that's a rule that could be in a particular ghost movies. They can only be active at night, or they can only be active within a certain distance from where they died, or if you have a certain symbol of power, like a cross or a Star of David or something that will ward them off, they can't come at you. Something like that. Just some basic rules that the ghosts have to follow. And I think I know why the filmmakers who make those kind of ghost movies where the ghosts can do literally anything they want, I think I know why they do it. They do it because they're not really concerned so much with coherent storytelling as they are with creating fear and a creepy vibe. And there's something to be said for that. You know, if your entire point of making the movie is just to scare the audience, then fine, that's understandable. You don't necessarily care if your storyline makes sense or not, because that's not what you were going for. You were going for a scare. But I prefer the ones that actually do have both scary, creepy elements and a storyline that makes sense, that's coherent. Rules that the ghosts have to abide by. You know, not just godlike, powerful entities who can do whatever the heck they want to do. So maybe that's just a personal preference of mine. I like the ghost films that have more structure to them than the ones where the ghosts can just do whatever they want. And then that brings me to my last point of a real horror movie travesty, real problem with the horror movie genre that it needs to break away from at all costs. And that's torture porn. I liked the first Saw movie when it came out. It was something that hadn't really been done to a big degree. I mean, there's always been mutilations and blood and guts and everything in horror movies, but that kind of torture you just had never really seen too often in horror movies before, and especially not as popular as that movie ended up being. I liked the storyline. I liked the traps and everything. I thought they were interesting. I got off of the Saw bus, however, about movie 3. I think I went and saw movie 3, and then I stopped watching them after that. And of course, then there was a slew of knockoff films from that as well. There was the Turistas series. There was the Hostel series, and a lot of more low-budget one-shot movies that went direct-to-video that were fairly torture porn-esque as well. So there's way too many of them, and the more of them that came out, the less and less story they all had, including the Saw series itself. I hear tell from people that the very last movie in that series actually had a decent story and tied up all the loose ends and brought everything together pretty well for a conclusion. But it was like movie 7 by that point. I was long gone at that point. Didn't care anymore. It had just devolved into, let's make an outlandish of traps as we can possibly make and kill people in as messed up and gruesome ways as we possibly can for no reason other than for shock value and the shock factor of it. So I was off the torture porn train long before the last Saw movie came around. And they don't seem to be doing too much of them anymore. Ever since the Saw series ended, I think they've moved on from torture porn. So hopefully that holds and they don't go back to it. However, horror movies nowadays seem to be sliding into a totally new problem, the found footage genre, which I can't stand any more than I could stand torture porn. Frankly, I would rather go with torture porn than the found footage movies. I'm sorry, Paranormal Activity is not scary. It's not a scary movie. When I see a woman lying in a bed, and I'm looking at it through a home video setup, and the cover gets pulled off the bed while she's asleep, yeah, I know that was done with fishing line. That's not scary. And then she gets pulled out of the bed too. Guess what? I know that was done with a rope. It's not all that scary. I guess it's a suspension of disbelief issue, but I do not care for the Paranormal Activity series at all. And I know there's a new one of that coming out. They made 4 of them, and they're still going with that. There's another one of that. And there's been lots of found footage horror movies, especially. There's been like 2 or 3 exorcism ones, because there was The Last Exorcism and then The Last Exorcism 2, which is ironic because The Last Exorcism and then the sequel to The Last Exorcism. Well, that means that The Last Exorcism wasn't really The Last Exorcism, because there's another Last Exorcism. All right, I've gone cross-eyed. And The Devil Inside, The Bay recently was a found footage horror movie. I will give props to the Rec series. I believe it's Italian series, Rec, where it's the movie that Quarantine was based off of. Quarantine was alright, but the Rec series is awesome. Phenomenal. If you haven't checked those movies out, I highly recommend them, and those are really the only found footage movies I will ever recommend. but those are really good. But there's a lot of found footage horror movies nowadays. That seems to be the new thing. They've moved on from torture porn, and now they're into found footage as the new horror movie fad. And I was over it before it began. I mean, I was over it with the first Paranormal Activity. But there is hope, though. There is hope for the future of horror movies in the Insidious films. I really liked Insidious 1, and I freaking loved Insidious 2 that recently came out a couple months back. Sinister, a year or so ago, was also incredible, and I hear the same people, the same producers and everything are working on their next one that'll come out next year. Hopefully it'll be just as good as the previous 3 films were. So there is some hope for the horror movie genre as far as I'm concerned. They just need to stay away from these travesties that they've had in the past. The remakes of the popular series, the torture porn, the found footage, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre knockoffs, all of those kind of films, and also keep movies out of the hands of Rob Zombie because he doesn't know what he's doing. So that's my wrap-up of the horror movie genre and the travesties of the horror movie genre. Throughout it all, and throughout, though it seems like, I'm complaining a lot about the horror movie genre, it does still hold as one of my favorite, if not indeed favorite, genre of films of all time. So many great classic horror movies, and maybe in one of the future videos I'll do my rundown of the best horror movies of all time. So look for that in a future episode. But as for now, this is Mayhem and Random Fandom signing off. I'll see everybody next time.